What's up, Guardians? Today we're going to be doing the final part of my Director's Cut videos. We're doing Director's Cut Part 3 Summary. This one's going to be filled with a lot of information, but we're going to try and keep it simple and we're going to try and keep it quick. So let's get right into it. The first part of the Director's Cut, really quickly, is about damage indicators and basically how damage values are indicated to the player. They're going to be doing a little bit of tuning of that moving forward, coming into Shadowkeep. Particularly, there's an issue where you hit a max number of 999,999 damage. So they're getting rid of that, and they're curving values and things like that to display the damage to players better. Do keep in mind, this isn't affecting your overall outgoing damage. It's just changing the way the HUD and the UI interact with you and visibly indicate your number of damage to you. They're also changing what they call the immunity wall, which is essentially when you are 50 power below a certain enemy in the game, you do no damage. They're changing that to 100, which gives players that love to do PvE challenges another way to interact with ads by lowering their power level. So now you can do damage against ads up to 100 light level below that ad. So that's good. It's pretty interesting. I think that this opens the door for new challenges and new difficulties that weren't previously accessible for players because the ads were immune to damage. Previously in the last Director's Cut, really quickly, Luke Smith talked about the mods, and we talked about how there's energy specific mods. We also talked about how there are generic mods that work the same as those energy mods, but cost more points. That was listed in this Director's Cut at the beginning. Also, those generic mods that we were talking about previously, there are 11 of them in total, and you will unlock them automatically once Shadowkeep launches, so you'll be able to specialize your gear immediately. Debuffs and the stacking rules to these buffs and debuffs. Currently in Destiny, you can only have one single character-wide buff to you, and what that essentially means is if there's a buff, like for example the empowerment buff when standing in a rift as a warlock, it affects your entire character. It affects any damage from any of your weapons. You can only have one of those types of buffs on you at a single moment in time. And the way it currently works in Destiny is the most recent buff that's affected you is the buff that you currently have. So for example, if you have the Lumina buff from the Noble rounds, that's a huge spike to your damage, even more so than an Empowering Rift. However, if you have the Lumina buff on you and you step in an Empowerment Rift, it gets rid of the Lumina buff and replaces it with the Empowerment buff. That's how buffs currently work in Destiny, and what Luke Smith is saying in this section is that they're changing the way buffs and debuffs interact so that still you're only going to have one buff active on you at a time, one character-wide buff active on you at a time, and the way it's going to work now is whatever buff does helps you the most in terms of your damage in this case is the one that'll be applied. So for example, if you have the Lumina buff active on you and you step in Empowering Rift, they're not going to interact with each other and make you even stronger, but what's going to happen is instead you're going to keep the Lumina buff rather than swap over to the Empowering buff. For debuffs, it's going to work the same way. So essentially right now, for example, the main debuffs in the game are Tether, Tractor Cannon, and Melting Point. And what happens is, if you tether a boss, A, your power weapon doesn't get increased damage to the boss, which they're going to fix with Shadowkeep, and B, if another player then tractor cannons, then it negates the previous buff of the tether. And then if someone comes in at Melting Points, it negates that tractor cannon buff. I just whacked my mic. It negates that tractor cannon buff. So the way it's going to work now is, once again, the strongest debuff active on an enemy is the one that's going to apply to it. So if I tractor cannon and my teammate Melting Points, for example, in a strike, the Melting Point buff will apply because that's a larger and more effective debuff in the current case. They could tune all the power buffs and all the debuffs currently, so we don't exactly know what the best damage will be come Shadowkeep. However, that's how they're going to make it. It's going to make it a lot simpler, especially for match-made activities where you think you're helping your team by tractor cannoning, and at the exact same time you think you're going to help your team by tractor cannoning, another teammate thinks they're going to help by tethering the same boss, and it leads to a point where now you have no debuff on the boss because the two have canceled each other out. So that's very frustrating, and it's really good that these types of buffs and debuffs are getting fixed, and the stacking rule seems to be applied in a way that's much more beneficial to the players. I do want to say we were talking about character buffs there, so those are buffs that impact your entire damage from all three of your weapon sources. However, and those don't stack with each other. But, for example, if you have kill clip on a particular weapon or rampage on a particular weapon, those types of buffs only affect the single gun, which means those buffs will also stack with your character buff as well. So, that's good to keep in mind. For example, like something like Kindled Orchid with kill clip and rampage, though that gun won't become completely useless once Shadowkeep launches, because those two buffs will still interact the same way they have been. The next section is called Supers Everywhere, Masterwork Guns, Super Mods, Orbs Everywhere. Right now in Destiny 2, it's ridiculously easy to earn a super, and supers have become ridiculously powerful to a point where it's affecting both PvP too much and PvE. In Destiny 1, you didn't have Striker Titans running around the map and Warlocks flying through the air on fire, chucking swords down at everybody. So moving forward, Bungie kind of wants to restrict the power of your super and make it so that supers are both a strategic item in the game as well as can be challenged by players who are not in their super, rather than the current meta where kind of you see a super, you run and try and jump off a map before it kills you in something like comp. So to do this, they're going to decrease the damage resistance on roaming supers, therefore making it possible for players to actually challenge players in roaming supers, and making it a little bit more strategic as to when you should pop your roaming super to be as lethal as possible. On top of this change, they're also going to make supers a little bit more difficult to get by lowering the amount of energy you earn from both orbs and from kills/assists in both the Crucible and in PvE. This is a very interesting change. It's going to affect both, and hopefully these super nerfs don't affect PvE too much, while actually controlling PvP and kind of bringing PvP back to more of a gun skill game mode rather than a hang out, wait for super, and then kill their whole team or something like that. Heavy ammo is also getting some changes in PvP. Right now, you really have no idea if someone on the map has power ammo and who on the map has power ammo. So they want to make these changes. Hopefully, it doesn't say in the director's cut here, but hopefully they reduce the amount of times power ammo spawns for the game. And when power ammo spawns, someone's going to go pick it up, and everyone else has a little bit of time before that those heavy crates disappear to also go pick it up after the initial brick has been popped. The amount of ammo you'll get in a heavy brick in PvP will also be decreased, so people won't be running around with 50-40 rounds in their LMGs, hopefully. The goal of the heavy ammo changes is to kind of revert back to a more D1 scenario where heavy ammo spawned once a game and it was kind of a free-for-all bloodbath for the next 30 to 45 seconds of just spamming power ammo at each other. And if you were strategic enough to keep your power ammo during that time period, during that 30 seconds, 40 seconds of just rockets flying everywhere, machine guns fired everywhere, then you got to be really powerful the following minute or two because you had power ammo while no one else had. Because when people died in D1 with power ammo, bricks weren't spawning on the ground like they are in D2. The next section of the director's cut is probably the most important section of this director's cut, and that's focused on PvP game modes and PvP matchmaking. Luke Smith starts off by talking about Trials of the Nine and how it was never the success that they wanted that Trials of Osiris was, and how they changed it and made the rewards less enticing, made it too easy, and overall it didn't feel like the full experience that something like Trials of Osiris felt like. So they put Trials of the Nine on hiatus for now. However, I still think we could possibly be getting a Trials variant like Trials of Osiris coming back in the future seasons. The main thing they want to do with Crucible game modes is revert back to their groups of 3 ideology, where most activities in Destiny and in Destiny 2 are based around this idea of groups of 3. So you have either fire teams of 3 or fire teams of 6. And this makes it really easy to go from one activity to the next, like a raid to Menagerie to 6v6 Crucible, or a raid to different versions of a 3v3 Crucible. And the reason they do this is so that players don't have to kick members out of their fire team, don't have to remove friends, so they can go play a 4v4 mode over here and a 6-person raid over here and things like that. So going back to the Crucible game modes, there's going to be a lot of changes. The first one is they're changing the playlist. So first you're getting a classic playlist. This is a mix of Clash, Control, and Supremacy. It's 6v6 and it's a connection-based matchmaking system. The next thing they're also creating is an entirely different playlist where it's 6v6 Control, and it's a great way for new light players to get kind of acclimated to PvP. Competitive is also seeing some major changes in terms of its game modes. It's getting rid of every game mode except for survival, and it's swapping from a 4v4 playlist to a 3v3 playlist. But it still awards the same glory points that we're accustomed to earning, and Valor is still over in the Classic and in the Control playlist. There's also going to be a survival solo queue, so if you're a solo player that was having trouble in previous seasons because you were fighting a lot of teams of 4, teams of 3, and things like that, you're now going to have a dedicated place where you can play solo and earn glory points. I think all of this is actually just insane and overall really, really good for the game. I think that playlists really need to be divided up. Players needed more choice about what game modes they were allowed to go play. For example, in Destiny 1, you had so many options during the week. You had a Clash playlist, a Control playlist, you had a 3v3 playlist, a Rift playlist. You had literally any activity, any game mode you wanted to play at your fingertips. And in Destiny 2, we have like quick play and competitive, like something like Overwatch. The difference is Overwatch lets you play 6v6 everywhere, whereas Destiny 2 has like one section you're playing 6v6, another you're playing 4v4, there's a rumble over here. It was all really weird, and this overall, in my opinion, is way better. Give the player the choice of what game mode they want to play, and overall I think that's the best decision for this game. Now, moving into Elimination and the future for Trials of Osiris, I think there is a version of Trials of Osiris coming in the future. I don't think it's going to come with Shadowkeep, but I do think it's coming. Luke Smith said, going into Shadowkeep, Crucible Labs is going to be able to test 4 versions of Elimination, where they're testing respawns and they're testing heavy ammo spawns. And they're going to be able to do this on 2 old-time favorite maps, which are Widow's Court and Twilight Gap. He also said that the future of these tests are to find Elimination a more permanent home in the future, and I think that the idea is we test Elimination, they get the feedback they need to find the best version of Elimination possible, and they convert it into a pinnacle endgame PvP activity, something like Trials of Osiris, and that is its ultimate end place and the ultimate end goal. Now, I think that's a great idea. I think it's great to be able to, that we get to test and we get to choose kind of which game mode, which version of Elimination we like the best. And overall, I think this is a really good idea, and I think all of these changes are a really great way to kind of recreate and rebuild the foundation of PvP. And I think that the next year has a lot more in store for Crucible and PvP compared to the previous year, where we basically got an update in Forsaken and then never got anything back and never heard anything back for the next year or so. I think it's been almost 10 months, if not more now, since we've seen a new Crucible map. So he didn't talk about new maps besides Widow's Court and Twilight Gap, but hopefully we're going to get some new Crucible maps that are dedicated to 6v6 and some maps maybe dedicated to 3v3, although we kind of have plenty of those already in the game. They also talked about matchmaking and how matchmaking works currently in the different game modes. In quick play, there is no skill-based matchmaking. It's all connection. Your games are going to be really random in terms of quality of matches because you may get some blowouts. You may blow out the other team, and you may come across a really tight competitive match. And then obviously in competitive, your matchmaking is based on your glory score. And moving forward, they want to make some changes to the connection matchmaking currently going on in quick play. They do understand, Luke Smith says he understands that some matches, or sometimes when a matchmaking process is too skill-based, then it leads to every single Crucible match you play being a daunting and fatiguing task, where when there's not enough of this skill matchmaking going on and no skill matchmaking, every game is a stomp fest, and you could have an entire night of unlucky matchmaking where you get blown out of the water. And that's more and more likely for players that are not as good at the game or are brand new to the PvP scene. Obviously, they're going to find a lot more times where they're matching against players that are better than them. So they say that the ultimate goal is to create a night where you have blowouts, you get blown out, as well as you have competitive matches, and that's what they want to do with their matchmaking. The last section talks about an evolving world, and this is actually really cool and really interesting for Destiny 2. So, currently in Destiny, we have Forsaken, which was the Dreaming City DLC, and we had a bunch of cool lore and a bunch of cool story going on Dreaming City. A year later, it still hasn't even been resolved. I still don't even know what's going on there. It keeps reverting back to this 3-week cycle, and I don't know. It still hasn't ended. There's this lore thing going around on Twitter, but I hear that's kind of like a bunch of gibberish at the same time. So, currently, there is no ending to the Dreaming City story, which is really unfortunate for a lot of players who are really invested in the story of Destiny and invested in the lore. Same thing goes for the annual pass. The Drifters' entire story left completely wide open, and the Emissary has disappeared, and Trials of the Nine is on hiatus, so who knows when that's getting figured out. Black Armory, I don't even know if there was a story. And Season of Opulence, Callus is like, cool, you're a shadow now and working for me, bud. Like, none of these stories get finished in a concrete way and with a real good ending. Luke Smith wants to change that. He wants to create an evolving world where one season will transition into the next season, and a story is going to flow the entire way, where a season is going to have a beginning, a middle, a build-up, and an ultimate conclusion that leads into the next season. So this is really cool for the actual story of Destiny. There may actually be a consistent story going on for the next year of Destiny. That's what we can hope, at least. There is one important thing to take away from this evolving story thing, and that's that certain activities that you're probably paying for, are kind of going to disappear from the game and be removed from the game. Now, Luke Smith did mention that he understands the collection part of Destiny is so important to so many players, so the loot from those activities is going to be moved on and put somewhere else in the game in later seasons. However, you will have activities that you've paid for disappearing, most likely, come Shadowkeep and the future seasons. So, this is a really interesting point. Obviously, we haven't gotten a ton of information. It was very cryptic in the director's cut. Luke Smith hasn't said anything else about it, but moving forward, understand that there may be times where you purchase a season in this new a la carte style, where once that season ends, that activity you paid for might disappear, unlike something where you can always go back and do the forges from Black Armory, you can always go back and do Reckoning, and you can always go back and do the Menagerie. So it is important to keep those in mind. Otherwise, guys, that's it for all 3 director's part cuts. I attempted to make these short, however, obviously I failed at that challenge. This is probably the longest one. However, I recorded like 18 minutes over here on one of these 2 files, and I know for like half of that I was screaming at myself because I couldn't freaking talk right. So, hopefully you guys enjoyed these. Hopefully this is a great place to come back to look at those director's cut, and finally we can move on to some new Destiny content, particularly cross-save and the fact that I'm literally staring at my PC Guardian right now with all of my PS4 loot. So, hopefully you guys enjoyed these videos, and I'll see you in another one.